Hello, everybody. I am here today with author Amy Grech. Amy, thanks for taking some time out of your day to chat with me.
Thanks for having me, Steve. Thrilled to be here.
Yeah, really excited that we were able to have our schedules meet up and sit down for a conversation.
Definitely.
So, for people who aren't familiar with you or your work, can you tell us a little bit about what you've done and the kind of work that you write, the kind of work you've done?
Sure, absolutely. I've been publishing mainly in the horror genre for over 20 years. And then more recently, I branched out into writing crime fiction. I
Hmm.
had a book that was published, collection entitled Rage and Redemption, Alphabet City. It's actually newly out of print. That publisher and I parted ways, and I'm just going to take the high road here because I've pulled it off my website. But I will say that that freed up a lot, two novellas and a lot of stories. And I've sent the novellas out to another publisher, and they're under consideration. And the stories either may find homes in different anthologies, magazines, or and then be reprinted in another collection.
Hmm. So, when you send those out to a publisher, do they run that by you before it's published in a magazine or another publication? Do you get a heads up on where it'll be, or do you have approval on whether it'll be published?
Yes. So I actually had three short story collections published up. We'll go back in time. The first one was published by Two Backed Books back in 2006. It was entitled Apple of My Eye. It was mainly horror stories. I've written a couple of horror science fiction hybrid stories, which were fun as well. And so just really briefly, because Two Backed Books went out of business, they folded, unfortunately.
Hmm.
And then the rights to that collection reverted back to me. So I found another publisher. And then when all is said and done, because when I'm assembling a collection of my stories, I'm able to choose the order. And usually the publisher will not argue unless they really want to lead with a certain story.
Hmm.
So I retitled that collection, and it had two new stories when it was published in 2009 with Damnation Books, who I wouldn't be surprised if you hadn't heard of them because they also folded. The
Oh.
editor had a health issue in her family.
Oh no.
Yeah, so she didn't want to become one of those publishers who can't keep up. So she let all the authors know, and then in between 2009 and 2015, when my collection of crime fiction came out, in between, I've had over 100 short stories published
Wow.
in various magazines and anthologies. Yes, I run the gamut. I've also had a few poems published more recently. I had a poem in an anthology. It's a series. It's called the Hells series, and April Gray here in New York City is the editor. And her idea for last year was Hell's Mall. So stories that take place in a mall, Mall, but then of course, my writer's mind went to mall, Maul.
Yeah.
So I wrote actually a poem, and I don't know if you remember that drink, Orange Julius.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's the title of my poem. And it sort of gives the reader a bird's eye view of the mall circa 1980 something.
Oh wow.
And yeah, and then there's a violent incident. I don't want to give too many spoilers, but it was a very fun one to write. It's also a rhyming poem. Most of the poems that I've written do rhyme. They have a rhyme scheme, and there's probably even a more eloquent word than that, than rhyme scheme, that I'm forgetting. I was an English major way back in the day. I'll just say, at Ithaca College in upstate New York. Um, and for feel free to rein me in if I go off on a tangent, because
No,
sometimes
no, it's I'm enjoying it.
all right, great. Uh, so that's me continuing to evolve as an author. I actually wrote two of my poems started out in a little notebook, like this one.
Mm.
I always carry around with me. And another poem of mine, really briefly, was entitled "Machine Gun Latte," and allow me to explain. Back before COVID, when I still lived in the city full time, I'm working on moving back, but it's taking forever and a day. That could be a whole other conversation, so I'm not going to belabor that point. But so I would go back to Long Island, where I am now, the irony. But anyway, I would take the train, the Long Island Railroad. And so in Penn Station, I wrote this poem right after 9/11, like a year after. They had, for security, they have National Guard soldiers positioned throughout Penn Station, and they have AK-47 machine guns. And one of them actually had a Starbucks cup, the white cup, the iconic cup, in one hand. In the other hand, on the shoulder, he had his machine gun, and they have their trigger finger like at the ready, I guess they're supposed to, or out of habit, he did. And so
Wow.
I noticed him when I was rushing to catch a train. And then on the train, because it's an hour and a half from where I am now to the city, and that's just to Penn Station. Then to go on the subway, so that's why I really want to get back, because I went back 4 times this month.
Oh wow.
And it took me 3 hours to get back here one way, because after a certain time, the train um, is very staggered for the time that it will go places. So that was quite challenging. But so I wrote that poem, Machine Gun Latte, the first draft, in a notebook, and actually was published in the Horror Writers Association. We have a New York chapter, and it's members who live anywhere in New York. New York is a very large state. So they were looking for poems, and mine happened to be mainly stories, and mine happened to be the only poem set in various parts of New York. Some of the other stories are set in the Hudson Valley, New York City, of course, Long Island, or another suburb off the top of my head. So that's actually a good segue. Are you familiar with the Horror Writers Association?
I'm not. No.
Oh, okay. Oh, it's an amazing organization. I think I found them through an ad in Poets and Writers, no, Writers Digest, probably, magazine. I used to subscribe to the physical magazine in the 90s, mid 90s. And so I joined, and they used to have their annual convention in New York City, and now they have it all over. Most recently, it was in Rhode Island, and I took a road trip on Amtrak train with other writers. And then in
Oh wow.
Michigan, Michigan before the pandemic, so I flew to Michigan.
Hmm.
The air is so clean there. But to circle back a little more, the Horror Writers Association is actually a global nonprofit organization for writers, and I think we have over 2,000 members worldwide and growing. And you'll love this story. When we had the meeting in New York City, I had just met Harlan Ellison one year, and I was fresh out of college, so I didn't have a lot of spending money with me, because I was coming in from Long Island just for the day to the hotel, which was the Warwick Hotel. Excuse me. And after I had just met Harlan Ellison, I wanted to buy a T-shirt that the HWA was selling, and it was really cool. It was a red T-shirt with black lettering, a haunted house, bats flying, and their logo. And so I was $5 short or something like that, and Harlan Ellison pulled a $5 bill out of his wallet, and he slammed it into my hand, and he said, "Here, now you can buy your damn T-shirt." So that was pretty amazing. I've met other living legends over the years, Jack Ketchum,
Hmm.
who I befriended as well, and we would go to different conventions. I'd meet him with other writers, and he passed away sadly a few years ago. But he always drank Dewar's Rocks Scotch. And at one convention, ChillerCon in New Jersey, a fan gave him Johnny Walker, which I know because my father used to drink. It's like a premium Scotch.
Mm-hmm.
And I really don't care for Scotch, but Jack wanted to share with me and some of the other writers that he knew who were there, and he said, "Oh, let's all have a toast to the con," or something like that. And so he got some plastic cups, and I had some, and like, wow, it's like liquid fire when you're not used to drinking a certain kind of alcohol, right? I was like, and I didn't want to be like choking on it like a spaz, so I was like trying to sip it. But yeah, I recommend the Horror Writers Association because of the pandemic. StokerCon is what they renamed the annual convention.
Oh, okay.
A few years ago, I think they renamed it in 2016. And James Chambers is one of the co-chairs. He's a great guy. I've known him for over 20 years. We used to meet up in New York City in the late 90s, but it was never structured. We would just meet for drinks and dinner. But then we were in the second iteration of the New York chapter. Jim had sort of brought it back to life, pun intended. And more recently, he has a great co-chair, a co-coordinator. I forget the language I like to use, but her name is Carol Geisander, and she lives in Jersey, but there's not a New Jersey chapter of the HWA yet. And she lives really close by train or car. So I've known her for a couple years as well. She's really smart. She's really great at helping Jim. And what we do, again, before the pandemic, we used to have readings at different bars in New York City. And sometimes more than once a month. And also we used to go to New York City Comic-Con before the pandemic, the Brooklyn Book Festival. And now, of course, we've pivoted like everyone, like we're doing a StreamYard. Yeah. We meet over Zoom once a month, and Jim and Carol are phenomenal co-hosts of a once monthly reading series entitled Galactic Terrors. It streams the second Thursday of every month at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And I've read a couple of times, and I try to support the other authors, except last month I was in the city doing all the things. So I missed the July Galactic Terrors. I actually did go back and watch it because it is on YouTube. But normally you can do a live chat with the other people who are attending on YouTube. So that's one way that we've kept in touch, myself and the other members of my group. And more recently, there was an in-person reading at a ice cream shop called the Ample Hills Creamery in Brooklyn.
Oh, that sounds like fun.
It was, yeah. And so I got to reconnect with some of the members of my writers group in real life. But again, because I'm stranded in the suburbs, I had quite an adventure getting there. An Uber, on a drive to the train station. I won't give you the whole rundown, but even though it was exhausting, it was worth it. Because I had to go back. I had to go back to Long Island the same night. So yeah, it was great. Nothing beats an in-person reading. So let's hope that the Delta variant doesn't take hold too severely. Scary.
Let's hope so,
yeah. So that's my little intro. I guess I went off, and I might have covered some of your other questions, actually.
That's okay. So from your perspective as a woman in the industry, how has the industry changed?
Great question. When I started out in the mid 90s, um, a lot of publishers were used to publishing primarily male authors. So they were they didn't know what to make of me. That here's this really enthusiastic young woman, and we like her stories, but there was some hesitancy on their part to publish women, but then they started to come around. And as far as conventions, there used to be a convention on Long Island. It doesn't exist anymore, but it was called Icon. It was more science fiction, but they had some horror panels that I would speak on, and with other authors, like not just me. So yeah, I met other female horror authors and science fiction authors or speculative authors at Icon, Linda Addison, for one. And then as I touched upon earlier, the meeting the horror writers used to have in New York City. And then I went to World Horror Con back in 1998 in Georgia. I met Ed Lee. He's really sweet in real life. So as time went on, I would start doing readings at these live conventions. And at first, the other male authors were like, "Oh, who are you here with? Like, like who's your boyfriend or who's your husband?" They didn't get it that I was actually there as a female horror author, up and coming at the time, granted. But I said, "Oh no, I'm actually reading at 3 p.m. and if you want to check it out, come and see what I'm going to be doing." And some of them did, some of the male authors, and they were like, "Wow." They didn't say it out loud, but it was kind of implied, like, "Wow, I didn't know a woman could write such, like provocative horror." But then in the 2000s, early 2000s, it progressed so that more publishers were open to publishing from work from female authors. And sometimes I would get a close but no cigar personalized rejection, and some editors were actually open to me sending them my revision, which is always nice. And then sometimes I would sell it, and then other times I wouldn't. But even to this day, if a story or a poem of mine is rejected at one market, I'll go back like maybe a week or two later, or maybe even a month later, and then I'll actually see what didn't work in hindsight. And then like with the plot or characters, or like some egregious error of logic, even though it's fiction. Like this one character was sitting down, and then 10 pages later he's like running out of the room, but we don't know why, and things like that. So yeah, it's good to that I've matured, because when I was first starting out, I just wanted to maybe get the stories out before they were ready, and they would even end too abruptly, would sometimes be the feedback I would get from editors. But and now in 2018, StokerCon in Rhode Island, we actually had a panel, all female horror authors, myself, Megan R. Curie, April Gray, Elizabeth Massey. I'm trying to remember who else was on it. It was a couple of years ago now. But we packed the room. The audience, there wasn't an empty seat in the, conference room in this hotel. And that was very gratifying. First and foremost, and it wasn't just all women in the audience. There were a lot of male authors wanting to see what we had to say. So that was pretty exhilarating. And actually, I touched upon it before we went live, and you see the cover of the One That Got Away anthology that you've I'm glad you could embed that. And Candisha Press is an all-female publisher. All of their anthologies have female authors or authors who identify as female as contributors, and it's run by two amazing women, Jill, and I'm going to bungle her last name, Jill Guerreri, and she just added her female partner in crime, and I'm blanking on the other woman's name off the top of my head, unfortunately. But they know who they are.
They know who they are. Recently, especially with the pandemic and everything else going on, Amazon seems to have has a bigger place in our lives in general, but it seems like in publishing too. How has Amazon and self-publishing changed the industry?
I would say that more authors, even before the pandemic, like for example, April Gray, the editor I mentioned, she self-publishes all of the Hell's Mall anthologies on Amazon and also on Smashwords digitally. So Amazon really has opened a door, pun intended, for more authors who maybe don't want to deal with all the proverbial red tape that comes along with working with a traditional publisher. You have to wait for them to review your manuscript. Sometimes it could be 6 months later before they take you on. Really short sidebar that's relevant. Again, I'm going to take the high road, different publisher. Signed a contract with them for a crime novella of mine set in New York City, and they had a year to publish it. So the year came and went. It came close to being up to a year, and I messaged them on social, and I said, "Hey, I'm really excited. When are we going to get going?" And they said, "Oh yeah, we're 5 months behind." I said, "No, I have a contract that said you were going to publish by this date. The date is going to be like next week." And this was before the pandemic. And I said, I want you to agree in writing to revert my rights back to me. And then I got to take it elsewhere. And they understood. It was kind of unfortunate, but I didn't want to get burned.
Yeah.
So, but back to what you were asking about
Self-publishing.
yes.
Yeah.
Yes, they have a new platform for serials. What is it? It's called Vela, I think. And some of the authors I know are doing it. I should actually ask them how it's working out for them. It's a great concept because even though more people are trying to go out and do all the things again, but I was going to say when people were home almost all the time, they could look at a story on their Kindle, or if they wanted a physical book. I still prefer physical books. Maybe that's because as an author, royalties are higher for print sales versus Kindle sales. Little trick of the trade you may or may not have known.
Okay.
And I'm a little older, so I grew up reading physical books, so maybe that's part of it as well. But yeah, Amazon really has made it easier for authors, as I touched upon, who are sort of gun shy as far as not wanting to get burned by a contract, and the publisher is running behind, or they don't have creative control over the cover art. Sometimes that happens with publishers. That happened with one of my collections. I didn't like the cover at all. It even happened to Jack Ketchum back in the day. I forget which novel of his, but it had a cheerleader, a skeleton cheerleader on the cover. And he said, "Oh God, I hated that cover." But he didn't have the the writer in his contract that would let him, say, "Oh, I want to choose the cover art." So in that regard, Amazon, the author who's self-publishing can hire like a graphic designer to create a cover, or a lot of authors wear many hats and they can design the cover themselves.
Yeah.
So
It's amazing.
absolutely.
Yeah. A lot of work, I'm sure.
Yes, but some authors prefer that to have their hands in every aspect of their book or anthology or chapbook.
Yeah. What are some of the most unethical practices in the publishing industry?
Well, the biggest offender would be publishers who don't pay royalties, where the authors have to get legal. They have to get legal representation. Um, and that actually happened with, I think it was Disney, Walt Disney, a few years ago. And there was a big months ago, excuse me. There was a big campaign on social. The Horror Writers Association, the Science Fiction Writers, SIFWA, were really going after Disney, and I think it's still being mitigated, but it was a bad. That's a bad scene. But Disney, they were trying to figure. Oh, authors just will fall head over heels to work with Disney and have it on in their bio, on their resume, and yeah, no. A lot of authors are not savvy. Authors are not going to fall for that.
Hmm.
Another unsavory practice is, like I said, not honoring a contract. And luckily, I got my rights reverted back to me. But I've known authors who've actually had to get a lawyer, or they have a lawyer in their family, and the lawyer can has to go after the publisher. It could be
Wow.
quite expensive.
So when you receive a contract from a publisher, do you review and do you read it and sign it, or do you usually have either other people or a lawyer read it before you sign it?
When I first started out, one of my uncles is an environmental attorney, but he also does entertainment law, like on the side.
Hmm.
So I did give him one contract. For example, a film production company that's very well known, I won't say which one again, taking the high road, but they wanted to acquire one of my short stories. And then my uncle said, "Oh yeah, no, they don't want to pay you. They just want to maybe flash your name on the screen, like based on a story by." And I'm like, "Oh yeah, no, I know authors who get stories options for film or TV." So, but the way it was written, it was this particular contract. This was over 20 years ago, but I vaguely remember it was very flattering, obviously,
Yeah.
and
Oh, yeah.
you had to read between the lines. And my uncle helped me do that. And then I couldn't bother him with every contract. He's a partner in a firm in Connecticut. But then I got savvy, and I have gone back to publishers and say, no, I need to adjust this clause, or can we omit this? And if they don't want to do that, then it's a red flag,
Hmm.
in my opinion. Similar note, really quickly, I am for my day job, I'm a full-time freelance online marketing, SEO, search engine optimization, and content strategy specialist. And I mention it because I got burned in that arena starting out. And so now I get a retainer of 50% for various projects, because sometimes people, and this was even before COVID, but now with COVID, like someone in their family the client could have COVID, and then they're going to stop the project. But I've already gotten 50% up front.
Oh,
So,
wow.
I'm not totally in the doghouse financially. So, yeah, you live and learn. But yeah, I'm not shy. I will request changes to a contract before I sign it.
Are they usually pretty responsive when you want something changed, or does it just vary between each publisher?
It varies. And as I said earlier, if they don't want to amend something, that it's not worth working with them, in my opinion. So
Hmm.
I have said thank you, but no thank you. I don't always sign, every contract.
Yeah, you can't, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
You have to look out for your own best interest down the line.
Have you ever had another author that you've formed a relationship with come to you and say, "Would you read this for me and let me know if this is a bad contract?"
Um, I myself have not, but Brian Keene has said many times at different conventions when he was starting out, he had just met Jack Ketchum. I forget which convention, but Brian was at the bar, or Jack was at the bar, and Jack invited him over, and he said, let's have a drink, because Brian had a lot of questions about a contract that seemed very promising for one of his first novels. I mean, this was years ago, because Brian is very established, very prolific. He's got a great fan base, and but not to go off too far on a tangent. And Jack took out a red pen and he redlined the contract that Brian had, because it was back in the day where people still carried around paper contracts. um, at conventions if they wanted advice. And so Brian was eternally grateful, and I think Brian bought Jack a drink, or to say thank you. And he did. He requested the changes that Jack had suggested to the contract, and then he got what he wanted.
Oh,
Brian,
good.
yeah.
Uh, what's the best advice you've ever received in your writing career?
It would be write every day if you can, and if you can't, at least read every day, because some authors have more before the pandemic, but they had full-time jobs and they couldn't write every single day. But I used to write every day, but my day job, sometimes I'm onboarding a new client, which actually I was the other day, so I didn't get any writing done yesterday. Today I'm going to do an hour before I switch gears and stream some stuff on HBO Max or something. But yeah, there are nights, especially if there's an open call for an anthology that's only a few weeks or even a month. I don't have to stream something every night. I mean, my brain would be mush if I was watching Netflix, right, or Amazon Prime Video. So yeah, I mean, I'll do a marathon running session that's at night, for 4 or 5 hours. Um, I'm more creative at night. I'm a night owl,
Hmm.
but I find if an editor wants revisions back by a certain date, and if I have to work on it during the day, I'll do it in the evening.
Hmm.
My logical brain is more active during the morning for clients and things like that.
And more to the creative side at night.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Go to the dark side.
Yeah, exactly. That makes sense. And you did mention open calls for anthologies. When you see an open call for an anthology, how does that work? Do you contact so you submit your work for an anthology, or what's the process there?
Sure, it varies, but a lot of publishers. I'm not on Facebook. I never saw the appeal, but on Twitter, a lot of publishers, including Kandasha Press here, for the one that got away, Anthology Volume 3, I saw an open call. It might not have been on their Twitter feed. I think I might have gone to their website under submissions. It was over a year ago. But they loved my story. The story is set in New York City. It's entitled Cold Comfort.
Hmm.
And again, that's an all female TOC, and authors who identify as female, for me to clarify as well.
Yeah.
There's about 30 stories. And quite a range of work, too. Our individual interpretations of the expression, the one that got away.
Oh, that sounds like fun.
Yes.
Yeah. That's gonna be great. And how important is an editor?
Very important, because I find I don't do so many typos as like grammatical or spelling errors. I mean, I do occasionally, I'm not perfect, but more of my lapses are in logic. Like I might have a character sitting in the beginning of the story, and then he's running like down a New York City street, and we don't know why until I get called out on it by an editor. Developmental editor is for me is more important. In fact,
Mm.
invaluable.
So, is how important is it to find the right editor, or is it do you have to form a relationship with someone, or just kind of be on the same page, or do you just grab one and go, or does it matter, or are they pretty much all the same?
Oh no, it varies. Like if a story of mine is accepted to an anthology, they have their own editor. I can't bring in like an editor from like that I know from
Oh,
my
okay.
writers group. Um, but I actually have helped another writer in my writers group edit her novel during COVID, and like I was saying, developmental edits. This was like last year when I hardly had any of my clients for various reasons. So she was helping to keep me sane by asking me to edit her novel, and with everything going on, she's still has it on the back burner, but she's going to come back to it. But for me, I mean, I might confide in another writer in my group to have them, like give a story a once over. I guess a lot of people would call that a beta reader. Um,
Hmm.
so yeah, that's sort of how I work with regard to editors. Either the publisher has their own, or before I'll submit something, I'll run it by an author who I trust.
Mhm. So when an editor comes back with things that they want to see changed, do you have control over that? Can you say no? I want this way because of X, Y, and Z, or do they have final say?
For the most part, excuse me, they have final say, but there have been a couple of my stories where it was something that was regional. One of my stories takes place on Long Island, and it was like the layout of a park that exists. And it was a story that takes place in the winter, so I had to explain to the editor that it's just how like the park is laid out, and it actually works for the story. I don't want to give too much away for that story that's been published, but she agreed. We met halfway. But for the most part, I will defer to the editors. We'll do the edit track changes in Microsoft Word.
Hmm.
Yes,
And do you seek out reviewers?
I do. I mean, I don't make it's not a full time job for me, but what I do is I'll see where other authors are getting like a, a, a review, and then maybe a complimentary podcast like this,
Mhm.
and then I'll introduce myself to that reviewer. I'll send them an email, or if I follow them on Twitter, I'll DM them, direct message.
Mhm.
And I mean, they don't have to say yes, and sometimes they don't, or they say I'm backlogged until the end of the year, which is actually kind of fast approaching. The year's already half over, right? 2021, hard to believe.
It is, yeah.
So I've had that happen where maybe they'll say yeah, yes, but it's not going to be until the end of the year or next year. So I mean, I'm willing to wait because some of them are really well known and respected in the genre. So
Mhm.
I do seek them out. If I see that they're tweeting something on their feed, or another author who writes in a similar subgenre as I do, like I said, I write mainly crime, and my horror actually I've had ghost stories published. I've had psychological horror. I've had a story in a gore anthology. Actually, let me touch on that. The
Sure.
anthology is, called Gore Fest. And I actually found the publisher after doing a podcast with another author last year, and noticed that he published with them. And so they had an open call on their website, and the editor liked my story, but he asked me to revise it. My story is entitled 38 Special. It's Russian roulette gone wrong, because Russian roulette could turn into a cliche in and of itself. But yeah, I'll tell you what I did with it really quickly. So this woman has cheated on her husband, and the husband gets a hold of the guy she cheated with. Well, first of all, when they're playing Russian roulette, the gun goes off and it kills the woman, Heather. And then so the lover, is like a bat out of hell, out of the house when that happens. And it turns out that the husband is an IT specialist. There's actually an app for the iPhone. I forget the name, but it's in the story, and I looked it up. It's a real app, where you install and the person doesn't know that they're being monitored, and the other person can see all of their texts and social, etc. So that's how the husband knew she was having an affair for sure. He had like suspicions. So he takes the guy and he gets a hold of him in real life again, and he ties him up in his garage, which is soundproofed because his son has a band, like the kids, teenagers, and because Charlie's the guy who was cheating with Heather, and Brad is the husband. And so, Charlie's trying to scream for help, and then, Brad's like, oh, no one's going to hear you. So, they're going to play Russian roulette, except Charlie's tied up. So Brad's going to like take his turn, and no, he's going to keep clicking it just on Charlie, except Brad has really bad allergies, and I foreshadowed that by the cat coming into the garage. And then he picks up the cat and he tosses the cat in the house, except I don't know if you have pets, but cats shed, and then so the cat's fur's all over Brad's jeans, and then later he has an uncontrollable sneezing fit, and unfortunately for him, the gun discharges and it ricochets off something in the garage, and then the bullet kills him. And then we still have Charlie, who's got to get out of the garage. And so Brad was not really skilled at tying the knots when he tied up Charlie to a chair. And so Charlie's like getting out of the knots the whole time they're talking. And something else I looked up is, because I'm a city dweller for over 20 years, but if you have an automatic garage door opener, they have an emergency manual release.
Mm-hmm.
And so I watched a YouTube video on how it works to use it in the story. And so Charlie sees that when he's tied up, and then I have the language is it's like a ripcord, if only he can, get to it. And it's like in film, when you have anything in the first act, whether it's a cane or a gun or a knife or, like an apple peeler, it's in the first act, it's going to be in the third act. So I follow that in my writing. And so the allusion to the red cord, that's how Charlie gets out of the garage after he gets untied. And then he hightails it home. But yeah, that was a fun story to write. It was actually inspired by the movie The Deer Hunter, which I saw when I still lived with my parents fresh out of college. My father had rented it, or maybe I rented it. I might have rented it because I heard what it was about, and I wanted to see how they play that out. I think they're either Vietnam vets or they're still in Vietnam or it's after Vietnam. But yeah, so yeah, that was the inspiration. Partly was that movie, and also my personally, I have severe allergies, and sometimes I'll have a sneezing fit. So the editor loved that. He requested a revision, but then it was kind of awkward because I emailed him, and this was in March of this year. He requested the revision, and I said, "Okay, when do you need it by?" Because I have other projects. I'm also a freelancer. And he didn't tell me. And then in early June, I get the nudge, like, "Where's your revision?" And so I banged it out in like 2 days because he was basically saying, "I want it now," but not saying it.
Yeah.
But I got it to him in enough time. And then it's up for pre-order on Kindle, and then the paperback's going to come out in the fall.
Oh, good.
Yeah. So,
Yeah. Just check that one out.
yeah, thank you.
And what are your thoughts on content warnings?
Oh, you mean trigger warnings?
Mm-hmm.
I personally do not post them on my website, or most of the publishers I work with, to my knowledge, do not use them. But now, with everything going on in the world, there's actually been some backlash a few months ago. I think it was when it was like really flaring up on social, that authors really should have a trigger warning on their stories or on their website, and I still haven't done it on mine. I mean, I'm a horror author. I also write crime fiction. My trigger warning should just be there will be blood. I don't mean to make light of it. I'm sorry. It's just I personally don't do it, but I do understand how it could affect certain individuals if in their life at one time they might have been suicidal and they recovered, or they might have had a loved one who OD'd on drugs, or someone died in like a machine accident, like in the country, like one of those big machines, the wheat machines with the rotors and something like that. So yeah, I would be open to it if a publisher I work with in the future said, "Yeah, we just need you to put a trigger warning on your story or your novella." I would, but I think the other side of that coin is a lot of people feel it kind of spoils the surprise of the story, or like the mechanism of death, like, was it a murder? Was it a homicide? Like I have another story. It's not published yet. It's a novella, actually. It's a dystopian novella. And I wrote it before COVID, and I wrote it before Trump became president. And I mention this all because it's set in a world where they have to separate the wheat from the chaff. But by that, I mean the rich and the poor. And I know it's happened before, but in my story, what they do is they have a feast, and it's kind of like in New York State, we have a lottery, and they have like Powerball, and it's like a bingo machine, and the balls are, like all popping in the air, and then one of them gets sucked through the chute, like there's 6 of them or something. And so I did my riff on that. And so the winners, everyone in this village has to gather when like a siren goes off, because where I grew up and where I am now, there's a siren. It actually went off earlier in our conversation. I don't know if you noticed it.
Yeah.
It's going to be hard to edit out, but that's like part of the mystique of the horror writer, let's say. So the siren here goes off when there's a fire, and the local fire department has to go out. Actually, every day at noon, they do it also for whatever reason. But, that I grew up here, and so it was ingrained in my brain that might be like a good device in the story. So like in this story, my novella, every time a siren goes off in this village, they all the villagers have to gather in like a town square. And but then I've seen a lot of concerts in real life, so then there's like a big stage, and it's this big spectacle. It's called The Gathering, which like isn't even 100% original, but the two winners, they have drones, and the drones drop the balls because the people have to catch a ball. And it's also kind of like a homage to the Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and the Golden Ticket,
Yeah.
which I actually had in an earlier draft of this novella. But then when I would pitch it, agents would say, "Oh, it seems like a kid's book because you're referencing Charlie and the Chocolate Factory." And I'm like, "Oh, whoops. Okay, I got to change that." And also, like, these, think about it, drones releasing like ping pong kind of balls like can pelt people too. So then they're knocking out some of the people already. And so the people who go to this feast, they can eat any food they want. There's like famine in this village, like people can barely eat. So when they win and they get the ball, and the ball match is what they call at the stage at the spectacle, and they've got like the big flat screen TVs on the stage, and it's all this fanfare. But not to talk about the novella the whole time, but it's kind of relevant. It's kind of scary because a lot of other authors have predicted things that have happened in real life.
Mm-hmm.
And so, oh, I know what I was getting at. The mechanism of death in the novella is that the salt shakers have cyanide in them. And I actually did a lot of research. I love research. I did research about cyanide. What does it look like? I'm not going to buy cyanide, So you can just Google it and get images. And it's actually like a dirty, it's like beige. And so they have sugar in the raw. I don't know if you use it. I used to use it, but now I use Trevia, which is like from a stevia plant. It's even healthier.
Yeah.
But see, sugar in the raw is brown. And so on the table at this feast, they have like salt shakers. And so almost everyone but one little girl is eating like crappy food. They're putting salt on it. The salt shakers have cyanide in it. So the goal was like for everyone at the feast to just die gorging on all this food. And if their stomachs don't explode, they're going to die from cyanide. Then I looked up, how do you die if you ingest cyanide? And it's like you suffocate and like you foamy at the mouth. And
wow.
And it's like, yeah, I actually got hungry writing the story because these people who are starving want like Cherry's Jubilee, and they want like filet mignon, and the twist is the overlord of this whole maniacal scheme, his nickname is Big Kahuna, and he actually grew up really poor, and now he's a control freak, but he loves sushi and he loves sashimi. So at the feast, the one girl who eats healthy food that doesn't require sugar or salt, and the cyanide just looks like the father says to one of the kids, "Oh no, that's sugar in the raw. It's healthier." Like they think it's like sugar or something. And it all works well in the novella. It just hasn't found a home yet, but it is out somewhere, so I don't want to reveal the title. Mm-hmm. But the twist at the end of the novella, since I've told you so much already, and it might be 6 months before it's out there, when it does get picked up. But so the little girl, she serves the Big Kahuna guy some sashimi, and when no one is looking, she takes one of the salt shakers and she puts the cyanide on top, and then she hands it to him and she says "Bon appetit," and that's how the novella ends.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, he gets his just desserts, pun intended. So yeah, a lot of other authors I know, they've written stories unintentionally that were published right when the pandemic started, that were like kind of in one way or another about a pandemic or about masks, like figurative and literal.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah. What a world now, right?
Yeah, it has changed a lot.
Mm-hmm.
For you, what's the appeal of writing horror?
I grew up Catholic, so some of those Bible stories are downright scary. That would be one inspiration from an early age. Another would be when my mother and father and I were visiting an aunt one weekend in Kingston, New York. We drove there for the day. She handed me two of Stephen King's novels. I was 12 at the time. She handed me Cujo and Pet Cemetery. So those are the two novels I said I read first. Sorry, she said, "Oh, honey, I think you'll love these books. This author writes scary stories." And luckily, my parents were cool with it because, like, the cover of Cujo in the 80s was like, the Saint Bernard, the teeth, and like, like open like this, and you would think that might be a red flag from my parents, but luckily they didn't have a problem with it, and I've been reading his novels ever since. I don't think I've read everything he's written because he's so prolific, but I did just buy his novel Later at Target the other day. I started reading it the other night, so good stuff as always.
Yeah.
So those are the main reasons why I write horror.
Cujo.
Yeah, I don't remember if I read Cujo or Pet Cemetery first because it's like I'm not 12 anymore, but it's a long time ago. But I wanted more, I didn't get scared.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, absolutely.
Writing an effective short story is difficult because you have to get the reader engaged and give them a story that they're satisfied with in a short period of time. How do you write an effective short story?
It varies. Sometimes I'll start out with the title and then I'll build my characters around a title. For example, a story I had published way back in the late 90s was entitled Deadeye. Deadeye is slang for like an expert marksman. I looked it up just to be sure what the meaning was. So I actually started writing the story based on just that expression, Deadeye. And it's been published, so I could summarize the plot really quickly. It's about a young boy who his father hunts in the woods, and so he wants to be like his dad. And he starts out with a BB gun at the state fair, and he wins like a prize. Like the guy is at the fair is like, wow, in awe. And then the boy takes his father's rifle out without his permission. And there's a lot of Easter eggs in my stories and novellas. And the Easter egg in the story Deadeye is that, again, I wrote it when I still lived on Long Island full time before I moved to the city. There was a shooter on the Long Island Railroad. I think his name was even Colin Ferguson. I don't know if I'm remembering his name correctly. But, that sticks with you, especially when I was taking the train into the city. Because I was working in Manhattan and I was young enough where I could tolerate like 4 hours a day round trip, but now not so much. So the boy shoots up a train with his father's rifle, and it was before iPhone. So in the story, he's got a camcorder and he takes it out and he puts it on a tripod and he films himself shooting up the train. And then he goes and he brings the tape back to his father. But before he could play the tape, it's on the news that someone shot up a train. And then, the son's like, yeah, that was me. And then he's like, oh, are you proud? Because, I forgot to mention that the boy shoots a squirrel or a chipmunk, and then he doesn't kill it. And so his father's not impressed. So he says, next time you better bring me something that's dead. So he shoots a squirrel a few days later. And the BB gun, it was a BB gun, I guess, and it gets lodged in the squirrel's eye. And so that's foreshadowing. That's the first act, right? So in the third act, the father's furious and he grabs the rifle from his son, and the safety isn't on, or I forget. I don't think rifles have safeties really, because I was called out that I have to know my guns better. I had a story published and I referenced a gun that didn't have a safety, but I said it had a safety. I don't think rifles do, so let me correct myself. But so the father, when he has the rifle, he grabs and his trigger finger, he's got like a wily trigger finger from like being a hunter, I guess. And he, oh, I know what it is. The son reloaded the rifle after he took it out, so his father wouldn't know, because it's usually like not loaded in the garage. So the father grabs the rifle and like by the trigger, and he kills his own son with it because he didn't know it was loaded. And the bullet lodges itself in the boy's left eye.
Oh.
Like the squirrel. So he's no better than the prey. The predator becomes the prey. There's a lot happening there. So that was a fun one to write. It was actually also inspired by one of Jack Ketchum's stories, The Rifle, mm-hmm. which was published in Cemetery Dance magazine eons ago. And it was very flattering because I was actually in an anthology with Jack Ketchum entitled Funeral Party 2. Came out in 1997. And so Jack had read my story because we're in the same book together. And he said, I really loved your story. It was well done. And that's very gratifying. A living legend, telling me that, first of all. And I'm a woman, right? So, he's like, I said, it was inspired by your story, The Rifle. And he said, oh, I could definitely see that. So that was really cool.
Do you believe in writer's block?
I do. Yeah, like a lot of writers. I won't say every writer, because some writers I know were not affected when the pandemic hit. But for me, I couldn't write for a good 2 months because, the news was bombarding us with, like in New York City, we were on lockdown and for quite some time in 2020. And it was too much to process to see all these shops, like are closed, restaurants are closed, you can't go anywhere. And so I couldn't be creative until I wrap myself around this new reality. So I do believe in writer's block. And even now that we're kind of in the new normal, hopefully not forever, but sometimes I'll get writer's block, and it might be because, like I said, I was onboarding new clients the other day. They pay a little quicker than the publishers, so they sometimes become my primary focus for a couple of days. So it's not necessarily writer's block per se, but it's that I can't get into my creative headspace long enough, maybe on a certain day. So yeah, I do have times where I can't be creative on a certain day sometimes because of deadlines, or it might be more than one day.
And how do you deal with negative feedback?
Well, everyone is entitled to their opinion, is what I like to say. Some authors go to pieces if they get like a negative review on Amazon or Goodreads, or which Amazon owns Goodreads, but so they're pretty much the same entity, or Barnes and Noble, or even at a con or a reading, and someone might have a snide remark in real life, which could be more hurtful. Actually, that happened to me. I read a story of mine that was published, and it's, I guess you could call it a quiet horror story. It's entitled, it was in another all-female anthology called Frightmare that came out in like the mid-2000s. And I actually, this sounds arrogant, but since I have so many titles out there, I forget the exact title of it. But the plot was based on real life again. On the news, there's this young girl who had, I think it was cerebral palsy, where she was in a wheelchair all the time, and like she, her hands are like this, she can't do a lot. And so her father took her out to his van, like in the garage, and then did the hose and for the carbon monoxide to fill up the van, and like killed her that way because she couldn't have like a quality of life. So I wrote a story around that, but mine takes place right before Christmas time. And it's called Snow Angel. There we go. It's coming back to me now. Because the father makes a snow angel for the girl who's paralyzed in a wheelchair, and he takes food coloring. So it actually looks like his daughter. Like he takes yellow for her blonde hair because the daughter has blonde hair, and like pink for her jacket, and like blue for her pants or whatever. And it's a story that people who are parents said it really got them in all the feels. And I'm not a parent, but based on seeing that news story, actually years before, because like I had to process it to like make it like real. Because then there's the father who kills the daughter, but the wife obviously is against it. And so they argue about it, and then they all go out in the backyard as a family, and like the daughter sings "Hark the Herald Angels Sing" and all this angel imagery, snow angel, etc. But so I read that in a live reading, and one of the audience members is like, when I was done, I think right when I finished, he like even shouted, he's like, "That wasn't horror." Yeah.
Oh, that's
But
really rude.
another author defended me, and she said, yes, it is. It's quiet horror. It's not splatterpunk. There are different subgenres. She was explaining to this audience member. And then he slinked away.
Rightfully so.
Yeah. So there you have it.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
And I always wonder, especially with horror authors, have you ever have you had any paranormal experiences or heard of any stories from people you know that have inspired stories you've written?
I did have a couple of paranormal experiences, and one of them I turned into a story that's coming out in an anthology. So I won't give the title of the story or the anthology, but I will say that my first apartment in Brooklyn was my grandmother's apartment, and I took it over after she moved into a nursing home. You can do that and you get a discount because you're family and if you have paperwork. So her apartment was, I'm pretty sure there was a ghost because like at night I didn't have any pets. And then like if you have a pet, or even like your spouse, like sitting on the bed or getting into bed and then you feel it. And then that would happen very often after my grandmother passed away. So yeah, it wasn't a malicious ghost, but another real life occurrence was when my father, right before he passed away, I had moved to a different apartment in Brooklyn in Park Slope, a nicer neighborhood. And I don't know if you ever watched that television show, Celebrity Ghost Stories. It used to be on Bio, and that whole network Bio went away. But anyway, there were these, famous people we know from film and TV, and a lot of them said if they saw a spirit, it was like an orb. You see an orb, a white circle, and I was shutting all the lights off before I went to bed in my apartment, and then in my living room I saw an orb, and I stopped and I looked at it, and it was actually like hovering, like you see in the movies, and for like I guess a couple of minutes, and I think that was like my father saying goodbye. I had actually, of course, seen him in the hospital, but then I couldn't get back out to Long Island to see him when he was in hospice. He was only in hospice for a day.
Oh.
Yeah, and he passed away 10 years ago now, but I think that was him saying goodbye, like the orb in my apartment. I didn't talk to it, but I acknowledged it, and I wasn't afraid, and I just looked at it, and so yeah, those were my main paranormal experiences personally.
I've heard a few stories like that. People, when someone they love passes away, they have some kind of experience after.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Do you leave secrets or Easter eggs in your books for people to find that you know about, but you wait and see if someone will catch it?
Yes, I do. one thing I do that you really have to be a hardcore fan of my work to catch is I'll reuse lines from metaphors from my from one story to another. But also pop culture Easter eggs. If that's what you're referring to, I think, right?
No, if even if it's plot lines or characters or quotes or like you said, lines that you've used previously.
I do use the lines I've used previously. The story in the One That Got Away anthology, Cold Comfort. Um, there's a line, you have to read the story, I won't quote it. But then I used it a few years ago in another story set in New York City, which was also published in one of my collections. And I do a lot of pop culture Easter eggs, like there's that movie Dog Day Afternoon. I don't know if you've seen it, but I use that in my crime novella that's out with the publisher currently. Excuse me, so I won't tell you the name of the novella, but I do use a scene where the main female character um, had gone to a movie theater that exists in Brooklyn. I don't know if it's still there because of COVID, but it was called Nighthawk Cinema. And that's a cool name, right? In and of
Yeah.
itself. And she had gone to see Dog Day Afternoon with friends one night. And then there's gang gunfire. And she's an innocent bystander. And this happens all the time in New York City, unfortunately. And a bullet grazes her arm. So she's got the scar. And it scares her. And so she goes and she signs up for conceal and carry training, because if you're a woman and you want to carry the Glock makes a baby Glock. They call it a
Hmm.
baby Glock. I went to their website, I did the research.
The subcompact.
Yes,
Yeah.
and you could fit it in your purse if you're a woman or transgender, because we're in this whole other world, right? And
Hmm.
um, so the character carries it in her purse, and she gives it. I love the name she gives it, but it's the name of the novella, so I won't tell you. But I will tell you, you can buy skins on these guns. Like you can buy a case for your iPhone, but it's for the gun. And so there's one you can get a hot pink leopard print. So that's what she gets on her Glock. And I was telling an author at Comic Con a few years ago about my novella in progress at the time, and he said, "Well, yeah, that's great, but she has to get a gun permit." And so I had to look up what's the process for that. It takes like 4 months, and you have to pay a lot of money, and then you have to do training at a shooting range. You can, you have to have all these credentials.
Hmm.
So I did all my homework, my due diligence. I learned about propellant and how these gun ranges have like these huge fans to suck out the smell of the propellant. It smells like rotten eggs, I think.
Hmm.
Um, I should have gone to a shooting range and actually fired a gun, but I've actually read horror stories where if you hold the gun the wrong way and it kicks the wrong way, like you could like bust your teeth and all
Yeah.
kinds of crazy stuff can happen. So I was a little, believe it or not, I was too afraid to actually go and pay and shoot a gun. But I watched videos of like there's so much language around it, like shooting stance, and you have to wear ear muffs so like you don't go deaf, and then like the goggles so like you don't shoot your eye out like a Christmas story.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm a big fan of research.
Yeah. It's important. I think it pays off.
Absolutely. Mhm.
Yeah. What would be something your readers would be surprised to learn about you?
Let's see. There's a couple of things. I have a twin brother, but my brother doesn't write. Uh, Trying to think if there's anything else I could give you. That I'm very tech savvy. I already told you what I do, but a lot of them don't know what I do for my full time freelance, but it's pretty full time. I do online marketing for different companies. I worked with a cosmetic surgeon for years, but then he got FDA approval for a minimally invasive surgical device, so he didn't need me anymore.
Oh,
But I do online marketing for a restaurant in New York City that actually opened during the pandemic.
brave.
Yeah, it's called Festival Cafe. I haven't eaten there yet, but I'm gonna wrangle up some friends and we're gonna go. They have a great menu. And I actually do social media management for authors, like their Instagram, their Twitter, and other businesses. Like I have a notary who's and a process server who's a client. Believe it or not, he has a website. I've worked with photographers over the years, so
Wow.
yeah, I guess I'd be surprised to learn that.
So when you manage a social media account for an author, for instance, do
Mhm.
you take complete control of that account?
No, it's partial control. The author I just started working with has two books launching within 2 months of one another. So as you can imagine, she's feeling overwhelmed. I mean, she gives me her login credentials, but she actually has two-factor authentication, which is a good idea. So I actually have to email her to ask her to send me the code that Twitter texts her, the
Yeah.
number, the number code. Or else I can't get into her account. But I don't do it every day. Sometimes I'll skip a day on her social because I have my own social. And I actually didn't mention, but I co-managed the Twitter account for the New York chapter of the Horror Writers Association with another author from our group, Alp Beck, also
Oh,
co-manages it.
oh, awesome.
Yeah.
You stay pretty busy. How do you manage all your time with your responsibilities and your other work you have in your writing? How do you balance everything?
It can be tough sometimes. For example, I love my mother, but she's in assisted living. I mentioned it because she has memory issues, and she wanted to talk to me yesterday. But even though it was the weekend, I was onboarding the new social media author client, and so I was kind of like, oh, how are you? I talked to you yesterday, and then I was like, oh, like, how are you? She just had some dental work done. So, I'm like, how's your mouth? But then she kept going. She didn't know I wanted to end the conversation. And I'm like, listen, I'm gonna tell you all about my weekend tomorrow. I'm sorry, I'm very busy. And she got kind of miffed, but I wouldn't have time to talk to her every day. I talk to her every other day. And of course, if she has an emergency, that's different. But like just to catch up.
Mhm.
So I have to compartmentalize my time. Like like I said, I try to do client work mainly in the morning, but if a deadline pops up in the afternoon or evening, I'll do it, especially if the client pays me up front for the month, like this author client did.
Mhm.
But usually that's why I just want to get a retainer, because one time I got bit in the ass because I took the money in full and then I got a corporate job. This
Mhm.
was like in 2007, but now with the pandemic, it makes you wonder if there'll be any corporate jobs ever again.
Yeah, you wonder that, don't you? It's a whole new world.
It is, absolutely.
Have any of your perspectives or beliefs been challenged during your career?
Um, yeah, I would say yes. I'm trying to think of an instance. Uh, just like I said, holding my ground with a contract that I didn't find acceptable.
Mhm.
And I went back to the publisher and just over email and said, can we change it? Or I changed it. Um, I had the professional version of Acrobat. It's called Adobe Acrobat DC or something, but it was another iteration. Not many people had it, so I actually edited the PDF contract, and they were kind of surprised I was able to do that. Number one, and then I'm like, yeah, either what I sent you, or I'm afraid it's not going to work out. And I guess they were used to being authors jumping at the chance, and I'm just like, yeah, no, sorry.
Yeah, but that's got to be difficult at first, right? To say no when you're, especially when you're a new writer.
It was, but I had to have my own best interest in mind. The contract, one of the contracts I just got out of, actually, I will never do it again unless it's a sweet deal, because it was a 5-year contract.
Hmm.
And then right before the pandemic, I actually had my gallbladder out in the city, and then the surgeon actually moved it up a week. Luckily, because I was in agonizing pain, or else I wouldn't have been able to have the surgery. Because that's considered a general surgery. It's not like like saving my life, so they wouldn't have done it. But I mention it because I was all set to contact that publisher to get out of the contract, but then I got sick and I had to recover, and I forgot about the contract. So they had a rider in their contract that said if I didn't contact them by a certain date, they got another year.
Oh wow.
Yeah, so the year came and went, and I wrote a very litigious sounding letter. And I was gonna send a return receipt requested, which I had to do like when I had a landlord issue in the 90s, but I didn't send it that way. And I emailed it, and I sent them a physical letter to show them I meant business, though. And this was last fall of 2020. And they said, or May of 20, no, around Labor Day, sorry, 2020. And then they said, well, you missed it because you didn't write back at a certain time. But they said your rights are going to revert back in May 10th of 2021. And they did. I actually Googled that title, Rage and Redemption, Alphabet City, and they took it off their website. And it took a while to go off of Amazon. Actually, it's still there, but it says out of print. I guess that's just what Amazon does.
Hmm.
But yeah, no, the rights reverted back to me. But yeah, that was a hard life lesson. If I'm going to do a 5-year contract, it has to be like a lot of money. And that one wasn't. So that was a hard life lesson.
Yeah. Well, we live and we learn, I guess.
Yes.
Yeah. If you can spend the day with any author alive or not, who would you spend the day with, and what would you ask them?
I would have to go with Edgar Allan Poe, because he's inspired a couple of my short stories. One that's up and coming in an anthology that I dare not mention, other than to say it's an anthology up and coming. Perhaps I've said too much, but yeah, just the language that Poe used, and bruised and battered, nevermore, hark the raven, and like the cask of Amontillado, and all of his stuff. It's just like there's so much imagery, there's so much going on, a lot of tension, and just to really pick his brain.
Mhm.
For sure.
Yeah, that's a good answer for that one.
Hmm.
Is Do you think horror is a genre that's accessible?
Could you be more specific?
Is it for the average reader? I think there's some readers have this perception that horror as a genre is reliant on cheap thrills or cheap scares instead of it being. And us horror readers, we know that it's sophisticated and it's deep and there's a lot, it's dense. There's a lot to it, but seems like some readers have this perception that it's too reliant on cheap scares. Do you feel like that's true, or do you feel like it's an accessible genre for a reader and a writer?
Great question. No, I would say the people who think it's just all cheap scares, obviously, number one, are not well read. Um, it's as accessible as readers want it to be.
Mhm.
Earlier when you were talking about trigger warnings, some readers are not going to read a story if they know there's a trigger warning, and they had something go on in their life that is hits too close to home.
Mhm.
Or even some movies, there's an argument that even, well, actually a lot of shows have added trigger warnings, like The Walking Dead, which I don't watch anymore, but when I used to watch it, Stranger Things with the strobe lights. There's actually a phenomenon. If you have a certain medical condition, you're going to have a seizure if you see like strobe lights, either in real life or even in the movie.
Yeah.
And others. Oh, I was watching that. This isn't horror, but I was watching this little series on Apple TV because it was free with my new iPhone. Physical, like about the 80s. You know, like the aerobics craze, and then the main character has an eating disorder.
Mm.
Or even The Crown, they had to have a disclaimer because Lady Diana was bulimic, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's becoming more prevalent in even movies and TV now. Now that I think about it, but yeah, to get back to what you're asking about horror being accessible, um, I think sometimes people might even dip a toe into a book. Like some of Ed Lee's stuff even was over the top for me, but I read it. Like Big Head. I don't know if you read Big Head back in the day. Yeah, it's like starts out and like there's this mongoloid creature and he's like cannibal and there's like incest and all kinds of stuff is
Oh,
going on.
wow.
So yeah.
Do you have a favorite book to movie adaptation?
Uh Boy, it's tough to pick just one because I grew up watching movies and I started reading at a young age. Um Well, let's see. Even though Stephen King hated it, The Shining, I would say.
Hmm.
I know he's been interviewed, and I either read an interview or saw him do at a live event. I've seen him at some live events in New York City, and he said he hated the adaptation of The Shining with Jack Nicholson and but Shelley Long, the woman with those googly eyes, like yeah. It's like I just remember her in the scene where he's coming through the door and her eyes, she's like, oh! But yeah, I thought that was amazing, that movie. Also, it came out when I was really young, so it was almost kind of taboo,
Mm-hmm.
and even I figured out the we there's really, it's kind of hard to spoil that one, it's so old, like red rum. I figured it out even as a kid. I'm like, yeah, that's murder, yeah, before they said it in the movie. I was like, yeah. Creative mind at work.
Have you seen or read Doctor Sleep?
Yes, both. That was a great adaptation as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we watched it recently. Our little book club. We watched the movie and then we came and we talked about it. So it was a good time.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I
Cool.
thought that was pretty well done. For new writers, what are if a new writer came to you, what are some of the most common questions they ask you?
um Believe it or not, where do you get your ideas?
Hmm.
I think it was either Stephen King or Robert Bloch. He has a quote. Robert Bloch, he said, someone said, where do you get your ideas? And he said, oh, I have a young boy's heart in a jar in my office, or something absurd like that. Um, yeah, that I think that might be the biggest one that newer authors, I kind of cringe and I have to be polite, but you would think they would know better to ask that. Maybe
Yeah.
I'm being a snob, um, but
Well,
that's
how do
the
you, yeah.
big one. Sorry?
How do you answer that though? I mean, what do you say to that? I mean, how?
Yeah, to be polite, I think I would say, because I think someone asked me that at a reading, and I read an excerpt for one of my stories set in New York City, which is almost all of my work, but not all of my stories. And I said, oh, I get a lot of inspiration from New York City, just different neighborhoods like Hell's Kitchen. That's where the story Cold Comfort and the one that got away is set. It's like a grittier neighborhood, or it used to be. And yeah, just say like people. I do a lot of people watching. Excuse me. And then I'll put people in my stories, and it may be someone like an ex boyfriend, or it might be an old landlord who was crazy, like batshit crazy, which happened to me. My last landlord in Bay Ridge, she was this nice 80-year-old lady, and I would catch her in lies all the time. Like,
Hmm.
they raised the rent, and the son was like, the handling all the business, and I would just pay her every month. And he said, "Oh yeah, my mother doesn't work." And then I saw her a month later because she wanted to be all friendly, and she was waiting outside the building, and she said, "Oh, I go to work now," because she spoke the broken English. She was from Greece. And then I held my tongue, and then I said to my brother, "Yeah, they're like such liars." So, like, she didn't really need extra money, and it was a little tighter. I made it work, but they raised the rent like $75.
Hmm.
Yeah, because in New York, when you rent, unless you rent stabilized, which I was for years, if you rent stabilized, they can only raise it a certain percent. But if you're not, like, they could go to town. But they liked me, so they only raised it $75 a month. But that adds up,
Oh
when you're
yeah,
on one income. So yeah.
yeah, definitely. And since the start of the pandemic, how has your view or your process changed in writing certain stories now that we live in this new world?
Yeah. I'm kind of shying away from, at least in my new work, from things that are dystopian. Because I
Hmm.
did talk about earlier the dystopian novella I edited for a market. Um, but I'm I'm trying to do maybe more psychological, quieter horror stories, as opposed to some of the splatterpunk stuff that I've done, I guess.
Is it hits a little too close to home? Is that kind of just to have an escape? Is that part of it?
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it for me.
Mhm. Yeah. I think for readers too, I think even in the mid 2000s when a lot of these war movies were coming out, they didn't do so well, but I think people were just fatigued with real war and they just didn't want to go watch a movie about more. So,
Yeah, absolutely. I'm
yeah.
just gonna move because, like, the sun is reflecting off my laptop screen and blinding me. So you get to see the living room.
Awesome.
Woo. All right.
Yeah, I think that was all my questions for you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
This was a lot of fun.
Yeah,
Thank
thank you
you
so
for
much.
having me. Yeah.
Yeah. And for people who want to find more about you or want to find your work, where can they find you?
Absolutely. Thanks for asking. I have a website. It's crimsonscreams.com. And then I'm on Twitter, Amy underscore Grech at Twitter.
Awesome. And I'll put all those links down below for anyone to find you.
Perfect. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. It was a great time. I learned a lot from our talk. So,
Oh, great. Yeah, my pleasure. This was fun.
yeah.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.